This video is the third in a retrospective series of videos looking back at the Precure franchise as a whole. While you can certainly watch this one on its own, the context of the others may be helpful, especially for this season where I will be talking about it in comparison to the prior two quite a few times. Thanks! Futari Wa Pretty Cure Splash Star looks at first glance like it's some kind of weird copy of Futari Wa Pretty Cure. There are so many things about it that look ever so slightly similar in a way that feels like copying someone's homework while also changing a few things so it doesn't look like you copied. However, there's enough here that I feel like this season is able to stand on its own. It was definitely something of a transition period in the franchise, though. From the outside looking in, it seems to me the mandate was to make things different, but not too different, in order to avoid alienating the kids who were still enjoying the series. No Magical Girl series is capable of running forever without some major changes here or there. Futari and Max Heart had basically exhausted everything there was to do with those characters. Even in the seasons they had, some of the adventures were starting to feel repetitive. To reboot somewhat was a pretty solid solution to that problem. And doing it in this way, where there is some clear visual signals of similarity, does allow the franchise to sort of ease us into the idea of having a different team each time, while also giving us some familiar touch points to hold on to. Like I said, different, but not too different. So, what's the deal this time? Well, we've got a whole new set of everything to deal with. Once again, we have two fairly regular girls who are swept up in something magical, Saki and Mai, along with a fresh set of mascot characters to guide them through the experience. Now, instead of the Garden of Light to protect, we have the Land of Fountains, and the goal is to preserve the one fountain that the villains have yet to get their hands on while trying to restore the ones that have already been destroyed in the meantime. This means that it is a game of trying to gain back stronger footing from an initially less advantageous position. At first, I thought this might mean that the whole Precure squad would have to be more proactive, but that didn't turn out to be the case, which is fine since that's not what the show was going for in the first place after all. This restoration is done by collecting this season's MacGuffins, known as Miracle Drops, seemingly gained each and every time a villain is defeated, though we might not actually see it each time that they're gotten. This season has a much stronger theme than those that came before. Futari Wa and Max Heart were running with a simple light versus dark theme to them, which wasn't bad, just simple and straightforward. This time around, the theme is overwhelmingly the beauty of the natural world and the effort that it takes to preserve it. The setting is really what sells this. We're still in a modern town, but now it's a smaller one that's nestled right up against a seashore and surrounded by lush forests. There's less skyscrapers and more nature paths. One of the major locations is a massive tree that sits atop a hill, and many conflicts take place on bluffs overlooking the ocean or just right on the beach itself. Because of the setting, that naturalism works its way into every episode very naturally. I found this setting to be more memorable compared to the generic city of the prior seasons, which is helping this season stick a little more firmly in my mind, even as I write this having finished the show a while ago now. But what good is a setting without characters to inhabit it? Not much, really. This time around, we have Saki and Mai, both of which are our main duo. Just looking at them, you can tell the ways that they were designed to draw at least visual parallel to their main predecessors. But let's see if they have more going on under the hood. Let's start with Saki. At first glance, she does seem like she's just Nagisa 2.0. She's a sporty character who's not academically the strongest and lives with both parents and a little sibling. It would be easy to just dismiss her as a Nagisa that just plays softball instead of lacrosse. However, over the course of the season, I think she does enough to distinguish herself, but perhaps not in the best way. You see, to me, Saki feels a little like she's what you might get if you sanded some of the harsher edges off of Nagisa. While Nagisa was a good kid, she could still be your typical 13-year-old, which meant that she could be a little bratty at times. Saki, on the other hand, is more emotionally mature, which isn't a bad thing, but does mean that she's got a little less room to grow as a result. She's more willing to help her family out and be useful, for example, and is seen regularly working in the bakery that her parents own. That's not to say she can't be childish in her own way, though. She does have her moments, though these come through more in the emotion of the situation rather than in her behavior. However, I don't think that's an entirely bad thing either. One example that comes to mind is episode 35, the episode where Saki's team loses their last big game, which puts their season to an end. It's something that hurts and is disappointing, but you don't win everything. It's made clear that it's okay to be upset, though, in the way that Saki has a moment to herself where she just sits in the dugout and has a private cry. It's not something to take out on the other team, but it's okay for her to need a moment to be upset. It's a great thing to demonstrate to kids, and the lesson comes in the form of how she handles it already, rather than her having to learn how to handle it, which makes her come off as a little more grown up already. This, of course, turns into an ideological battle when the villain shows up to interrupt her cry and talks about there not being any value in losing, which is where Saki gets to argue the opposite over the course of the fight that ensues afterward. She's a little more put together, which means she's a little less entertaining and a little less charming as a result. It's not that I don't like her, but it's that I wish that I could have gotten a little more from her at times. She's also the one to get a romantic subplot, but it's not like it really goes anywhere. She's got a crush on her bestie's older brother, and while this is something that could have given the whole affair a little tension and drama, it comes up so infrequently that each time I was going, oh yeah, that's something we're doing. However, I found it a little less annoying. For one, it's played much more like her just having a little crush on an older boy she thinks is cute, and less like it's something that's actually going to happen or have progress, so I'm less disappointed when there isn't any. And for two, Saki has less of a switch being flipped when she interacts with him. She's a bit more bashful, sure, but it's not like she's going from brash to practically mute and unable to even speak with him. Mai is our other Pretty Cure. She's new in town after moving there with her parents at the start of the series, but that doesn't stop her from slotting right into her new life and school. Instead of being a woman in STEM, this time she's an art girly, and I think that did open up some more avenues for characterization in her. From early on, there are some points where it's clear that Mai isn't always completely confident in her work, despite the encouragement from others. She does have doubts when it comes to her art, a natural thing to crop up, especially at that age. This means that we do get some more focus on her than we did on Haneka's pursuits in the past. Once again, it's just a case where it feels like she's lacking a little of the charm that the prior seasons have, despite the fact that she's overall a stronger character. It's not that she's bad, just that I don't feel that much of a connection to her, if that makes sense. Maybe it's just my feelings being a little more diluted this time around, though. That being said, the series as a whole is helped a lot by the side characters feeling more fleshed out in comparison to their predecessors. In specific, I can actually remember specific classmates that the girls have this time around instead of them just being an indistinct blob. Are these the most fleshed out side characters in the world? Not really, and there are some missed opportunities with them, but a lot of them are a lot more fun than those we've had before, so they stick out in my mind. For example, this kid right here, Kenta, he's a little obnoxious, but it's in a way that's also endearing at the same time. He's the son of a couple who run a fishing boat rental shop, but that's not the business that he wants to go into when he grows up. Little guy wants to be a comedian. He sucks at it from my perspective, but a lot of his humor is pun and wordplay based, which isn't really my jam, so it wasn't going to be exactly a fan of him in the first place. Eventually, he basically forces another student, Manabu, into starting up a manzai act with him. And here's the thing. By the time that happens, Manabu is already a fairly fleshed out character himself, having gotten an episode or two where he was the focal side character. He struggles with his self-confidence when it comes to speaking in front of others, despite being the class president, something he is helped with by another side character, Kayo, who has her own focal point as being someone who helps out with the younger kids at the local library. There are several side students here who have more going on than just being a classmate to the main characters, which I think is great to see. There's actually enough here that I end up feeling if I tried and maybe gave the season another watch, I might be able to draw out some level of map of character relationships for them, which is more than I can say for the side characters of the last 2 seasons. Even the families of the main girls end up feeling like they have something more to them than the ones in the prior seasons did. It's not that we even see all that much more of them, it's just that they're characterized a little differently, so they feel like they're more than just generic mom and dad. Like, Mai's mom is a researcher, and she's clearly super dedicated to what she does, to the point where she might overwork herself at times or get caught up in her work. That's more than I could tell you about Honoka's mom and dad. On top of that, we can see the ways in which having that at home growing up has rubbed off on Mai, giving her a strong work ethic. Once again, it's not the deepest of characterization in the world, but it's something more than we've had before, and I really appreciated that. The one problem with your main magical duo being, well, a duo of only 2 characters that has to sustain a series through nearly 50 episodes, or more in the case of Futari Wa and Maxheart, is that it can be a little hard to keep things fresh. You only have 2 characters, and unless their dynamic is consistently changing or something of that nature, it's quite possible that things might get a little dull. This is why I personally think when making a magical girl show that's going to run as long as one of these does, it's probably better to have at least a group of 3 that all have different dynamics and relationships with each other. I mean, what are you going to do? The only other characters that they're going to be hanging out with on a regular basis that know what's going on are the Mascots. Which brings us to the ones for this show. I have to admit, there isn't all that much to say. Flappy and Choppy are the main mascots for this season, the ones that live inside the transformation items, and they're fine. You see, they're pretty boring to me, all things considered. The 2 of them aren't doing all that much to distinguish themselves from Meppel and Mipple, as even their character designs are fairly similar to those 2. The only difference is that instead of the 2 mascots being in overly cutesy love with each other, in this case, Flappy has a crush on Choppy and hasn't spoken up to her about that yet. Not that that is anything that actually changes the dynamic that much, aside from him every once in a while giving her something of a longing look now and then. They're just not interesting, which I admittedly will take any day over a whiny and annoying mascot, let's be clear. However, it means they don't really add that much to the show, and it feels like there could have been a way to adjust things so they weren't needed as much. Then we have the mid-season edition mascots, which, I'm just gonna be real here, really don't need to exist. Moop and Foop are thinner than paper. They're so thin that the Pretty Cure Wiki, a place that is where dedicated fans can fill out pages and pages for all manner of characters and has intense detail on many of them, can only muster a single sentence to describe the personality of Moop. Quote, Moop is somewhat mischievous, but has a shy side. End quote. That's it. And yeah, that really is all there is to these 2. They're exceptionally generic, and I couldn't tell you any strong differences between the 2 of them. Both Moop and Foop exist purely to be a giver of power-ups like Poloon and Lulun did in the prior series, but other than that, you might forget they even exist when they're not on screen. The most notable thing about them is that after they are introduced, there is a 4-episode stretch where the conflict of the episode is that they're captured by the episode villain every single episode. I'm not kidding. There is a single episode break from that formula, and then it immediately happens for a 5th time in the next one. Getting captured is practically their entire personalities. Which leads us right into talking about those villains, and I am pleased to report that for the first time, I liked some Pretty Cure villains. Shocker, I know. The last 2 seasons had villains that were so bland that I barely even had anything to say about them, but now they actually have some life. This time around we have the group Dark Fall, who are trying to get their hands on all the fountains that I mentioned before. At the start of the series, they even have a pretty solid upper hand, having every fountain but one of them. It then becomes a game of trying to take back the fountains one by one from each of these folks, and they're doing this in a more entertaining way than the last season's villains. I was worried at first, since this plant guy here felt very much like one of the villains from the first season, focused purely on beating the girls. He's not much to write home about, but once we get through the first stretch of episodes with him, it feels like the writers loosened up and started having some fun. I am happy to say that Moe Rumba here is the first villain that I actually remembered the name of. Flamboyant and always dancing, this fire fellow brought some fun to the screen. Simply put, he's thin, but he's entertaining to watch, which already makes him more interesting than everyone that had came before him, and things trended upwards from there. Well, almost. You see, after Moe Rumba came this guy, Dorodoron, which has a name more fun than his personality. He's much quieter as a character and just barely beats out the unnotable plant guy who kicked the season off. Honestly, I think he was just an excuse for one of the characters to get a little joke by calling him Dorodorondono when the honorific was added to his name. Things pick back up again, though, with the introduction of Ms. Shitare. She's a whole lot of fun, too, and brings a different dynamic to the episodes that she's in. While a lot of the time up till now has been spent with the villains just waiting for their moment and then going on the attack, she's entertaining in that waiting period, as we often see her putting on costumes and hanging out in disguise before revealing herself and stirring things up. It's a very Team Rocket feeling setup, and I personally was entertained for the handful of episodes that comprised her arc. She also has some interesting interactions, which we'll get into in a little bit, that make her feel like one of the more conniving and developed of the group, rather than just being a villain whose only motive is to do as the big bad wants. And the last single villain stretch is handled by this guy, Kintoleski, the best one. His whole deal is that if he's going to do this, he wants to do it with an honorable battle rather than any trickery or anything like that. He's straight up walking up to the girls and challenging them or bringing them somewhere to fight. He's even fun in his off time, basically just jogging around and giving advice to people. He reminds me of that bit from Wreck-It Ralph, just because you are a bad guy does not mean you are a bad guy. He's genuinely one of the more stand-up the villains, which makes him cool. There's even a bit where he gives Saki advice on a drawing she's struggling with before he challenges her to a fight. The only problem is that none of these characters exist really until the one that came before them is finished off, which does separate the show into nice little arcs, but it also doesn't leave much room for them to have any interactions beside the typical scenes with the big bad where they're told this is their last chance like 3 different times. This does change at the end of the season, as the final arc is comprised of all of them being resurrected and coming in teams of 2 instead of 1 at a time, but given that this doesn't last more than a handful of episodes, we don't see that much of them getting to interact before they're all gone again. They're all working for this season's biggest bad, Akudaikon, who is the one that is relegated to just sitting in a throne menacingly all season before the finale. And it's just as boring as when the Dark King was doing that. He never ended up feeling like a threat because he never actually did anything. He was there, he made vague threats, but that's about it. In fact, the only reason that the scenes involving the villain lair were even remotely interesting was thanks to this guy, Goyan. I'm gonna be real though, all my notes just called him the Grand Vizier though. He's a Jafar sort of figure, you see, constantly bopping around as the right-hand man to the big bad. He's the one who ends up verbally giving most of the orders and making most of the threats. He's the one that actually has some level of a dynamic with each of the villains that get sent against the girls all season. For example, he and Mishitare are constantly trying to throw each other under the bus for favor. Around the mid-season, Goyan actually managed to get his hands on and capture Flappy and Choppy, meaning the girls are left with just Moop and Foop, but no way to transform at all, and no way to go to the Darkfall lair to get the other 2 back. So how do they get there? Nishitare lets them in because she doesn't want to see Goyan get a win, and she's petty like that. It's really the first time we see a super strong dynamic between any of the villains, and I was excited for that. It was a lot of fun to see these 2 try to get under each other's skins, which is why it's a bit of a shame to see Mishitare go, since it meant that dynamic went away too. When it comes to the villains, the time that both Mishitare and Goyan are both in the show together is easily the most entertaining portion. And it shouldn't be a shock to you that Goyan ends up being the actual big bad of the whole season when it comes down to it. He's been the one actually doing things the whole season, and when the big bad is finally about to make his move, he just usurps him on his own, which isn't hard to see coming. But given that he actually has some level of personality, that's more fun to experience, so I'm not upset about it. And that's it for villains, unless I'm forgetting something. Oh, right! Michiru and Kaoru are hands down one of the best elements of the show and one of the best handled. If you watched my video about Futari Wa Pretty Cure, then you'll remember me talking about a character called Kiria. He was fairly incidental, all things considered, so I'll completely forgive you if you even watched it and forgot. The long and the short of it, though, is that he was a character that infiltrated the school that the girls of that season were attending and integrated himself into their lives in order to search for a weakness to exploit. However, he ended up warming up to and starting a friendship with one of them, which was cut short when he was taken away by the bad guys, basically for going soft. Kiria was an interesting concept that didn't get much further than being a concept because he was only around for a small handful of episodes and then came back at the very, very end before not even having a presence in Max Heart. There was something there, but there wasn't enough time dedicated to it for it to be fleshed out into something actually good. Michiru and Kaoru are the good version of Kiria. Now, I know this won't be the only time that a villain is befriended. It's a common magical girl trope, after all, and I know there are a handful of them on the horizon in Pretty Cure, even if I don't know exactly what series they happen in. For now, though, having only watched the first 3 seasons, this is the best that it's been done so far. Michiru and Kaoru have a few things going for them that lends them the chance for their arc to go better than Kiria's was handled. 1, there's 2 of them, so instead of having them constantly be talking to the other villains as they have observations or talk to themselves, they're able to talk to each other. This leads to the both of them being able to work through their changing feelings as they change without the interference of the other villains. 2, they're given more screen time. This change feels a little more natural and gradual since they have a few more episodes for it to happen. Granted, it's not too many more episodes, but it's enough of an elevated screen presence that it feels like more is happening. For instance, Kiria only really interacted with the Pretty Cure of that season, while in this season, Kaoru actually develops a little bit of a relationship with Saki's little sister, something that ends up being a big catalyst for their change. And 3, they get to come back. Kiria only showed up in the 11th hour aside from one little dream appearance. Not only do Michiru and Kaoru get to come back after they are taken away and imprisoned for the crime of getting feelings, but they come back with several episodes left in the season, which leads to them actually fighting alongside Precure, and in the 11th hour, instead being granted pseudo-Precure forms. All of this stacks up and means that they feel a little more fleshed out. Unlike Kiria, I actually cared a little bit about these 2 and was glad to see them get to grow. That's not to say they're perfect, though. They are a source of late-game drama that didn't really feel like it needed to be there. Basically, the idea was that there was a chance they would disappear no matter who won in the end, which led to 2 death fake-outs in the last stretch of episodes, which really weren't needed. But other than that, I did end up liking them quite a lot, and like I said, they were a highlight of the season. I don't think this will take long, but let's run down the way battles go in this season real quick. As usual, the animation is pretty dang great all around, though it did feel to me that there were a few less times that I was truly wowed this season. Like a lot of things this season, it felt like they were playing it a bit safe. However, one big shakeup is that this time around there was a bit more magic and a bit less hand-to-hand combat. While the girls don't get any new big named magic attacks over the course of the season, they seem to have a little more basic utility magic going on here and there, mostly defensive stuff to draw out the main sections of the fights. It doesn't make that big of a difference, but it does lead to the season having a slightly different feel, as a lot of those crazy hand-to-hand moments are no longer there. And this is another season where everything is solved with a big friendship blast all the time, which did get repetitive after a while. Even once they get their power up, it's just swapping one big blast for another that's boosted by a magic item, really. It's nothing to write home about and carries the same problem as the earlier seasons. What's different this season, though, is starting in the middle of the season, each of the girls gets a new form and a new cure title and everything. Which, that's cool, but I don't understand why, other than marketing and to replace the transformation item in the middle of the season for more toy sales. Nothing really changes from them getting these new forms, and at first it doesn't even seem like they can control which one they end up in. In fact, there's no moment where there is a choice either, since it doesn't seem like there's a tactical reason to choose one or the other. It just really seems to be an alternate look and name and nothing else. This leads to the second form feeling like it adds nothing to the show. These are also never mixed and matched either. You always get Bloom and Egret or Bright and Windy. No other combination. The only other notable thing about fights that I noticed is that these two say I/we won't forgive you a lot more often than the prior Pretty Cures did. Which, it's not like that's an uncommon thing for a magical girl to say, to be fair, but it was only used a sparse handful of times in the first two seasons, but comes up a lot more often here, and I'm not sure what exactly caused the change. We might as well get into the movie while we're here, though there's not all that much to say about it. This time, the extra land that we're dealing with that only shows up in the movie is the Land of Clocks, which has the plot tipped off by time freezing while the girls are in the middle of a performance at a song contest, and they have to go and fix things. You know how it is. While that might be the adventure, that's not the real conflict of this one. The conflict falls very much into the realm of the girls being out of sync because they've got a bit of a problem of arguments stacking on top of each other. It starts with one little disagreement because Saki is running late for the contest and they almost get barred from entering because of that, which feels like a real tween conflict that I could believe girls their age would passive-aggressively fight about. But before they can resolve their feelings about that, another thing comes up and then another. It's just one thing after another that starts snowballing, which feels legit. Sometimes life just happens like that. And even if there are some great animation cuts, it's clear the girls aren't in sync with each other, which leads to them being unable to initially stop the villain. The problem is that when the two get separated for the obligatory low point of the movie where it feels all is lost, they're talking about how the other hates them and how they might not be able to be partners anymore. But their fights never felt like they built up to it being that bad, which I think is just a downside of this movie running only for 50 minutes, which is barely longer than 2 episodes. I don't think it would have done them any good to make the movie longer, to be clear, because it's otherwise nice and tightly paced, but it does lead to this portion feeling like it doesn't quite properly worked. But even if the build-up isn't perfect, the resolution of this does culminate in what has to be one of my favorite moments in all of Splash Star. Saki and Mai standing back to back and holding hands. As they reconcile, they slowly transform piece by piece. It's a really sweet moment and a nice way of incorporating the magic side of their lives into a more personal moment. Alright, let's run down the magic items, how much of a role they play, and if they're even worth existing in my very biased opinion. The Mix Commune. This is the first transformation item of the season, and it's a sort of cell phone shape, just like the last round were. We see these less because it does feel like the mascots spend less time in their item forms, mostly because there's no mention of a restriction that they can't maintain their mascot shapes like the last little round of Buddies had. My feelings still stand, and I think this is a good magical item for a magical girl series of that era. Once again, a cell phone was something a girl that age might have, but would also feel like a little bit of a luxury, so to the little girls watching, it would feel grown up. These had those cards again, though this time they were diamond-shaped and slotted into a spinny thing on the Mixed Commune, which does add a bit of a fantastical twist to the phone, which I like. Then we have the Crystal Communes, which were the second transformation item, where the girls were downgraded from cool flip phones to Nokia bricks. There's not much of a difference here, even though this is a blatant toy grab, which makes them suck, in my opinion, though it does seem to just drop the card element at the same time, which is odd. However, correct me if I'm wrong, but these feel a little inconsistent. When they first get these, they have to shake them in order to feed the mascots, but later on they have to shake them and then blow on the resulting bubble as well. I could be misremembering, to be clear, but it felt like this was something that might have been added in the last minute because of that. The Fairy Carafe is our MacGuffin holder of the season that doesn't feel like it's in theme at all, which is really odd. Like, there's nothing cafe or coffee about this season. The closest is that Saki's family has a bakery, but okay, a carafe to hold our little gems we collect, I guess. It feels out of place, but otherwise I don't really have a problem with a MacGuffin holder in general. My gripe I do have is that it's got this big clear section at the bottom, but we only ever put 6 MacGuffin balls in there before pouring them out to fix a fountain, so that bottom part never fills up, leaving me feeling childishly unfulfilled. Then we have the magic pencil cases. These aren't needed and are just here to sell stationery like last season's diaries. The only notable thing about them is that they are transformed from their current pencil cases instead of being given as a gift like past instances. And we have the Splash Commune, which shows up halfway through the season as the little computer thing that Moop and Foop can live in and give their power up from. That's it. It's just a power up provider item again, though this one feels extra unnecessary since the mascots are more often than not mascot shaped. Like, it feels like the only time this one does show up is for the granting of power ups, and that's it. Exceptionally superfluous. And last but not least, the power up item of the season, the spiral rings. This is the final big attack power-up item that you need to play Pretty Cure with your friends, and they're fine. Nothing to write home about. Fairly standard sort of a power-up, all things considered. The only notable thing about this is that it is the first time that the cures of a season have had different looking power-up items, which does lend them a touch of personality, if nothing else. Overall, you could cut about half these items and not have to change the show all that much, which does make this season feel like more of a toy commercial. Alright, fashion time. Though there are fewer looks, so this should go a little faster than it did last time around. Let me just say that overall the looks are a step down in general and plain and simply mostly ugly this season. I can't say that I loved any of them. 5th place is Cure Bright. Just look at this. It makes my eyes bleed. That highlighter yellow is not a good color, and I hate it every time this shows up on screen. 4th place is Cure Bloom. It's better by merit of not looking like it was colored with a highlighter, but that doesn't make it good. The shape is weird by being both sharp and ruffled at the same time. While I understand the skirt was meant to look something like a flower, it's just not working. It feels a bit too childish to take her seriously as a fighter, and the hair is absolutely whack. 3rd place, I'm counting Michiru and Kaoru's outfits that they get late in the season. They might not officially be Precure, but hey, they got cool ass-kicking outfits, so they get to be in Fashion Corner. These are fine. I'm just kind of lukewarm to them. I don't particularly like the yellow, but at least it matches well with the blue, and the way that these feel like a set is fitting. I'm not wowed, but I'm not offended either. 2nd place is Cure Egret. This one is also fine. It runs a little into the issue of sharp and rounded shapes not mixing super great here, but it feels more consistent than Bloom did in that regard. I like the colors for the most part, though I would nix the pink in there since it's not doing much for the composition as a whole. Once again, though, the hair is bad. And 1st place goes to Cure Windy. This design does give the vibe of wind. It's light and breezy looking, and I love the colors here. I think what holds it back, first off, is that the hair is still awful and I will hate it forever. But it's also held back by the need to keep the bracer pieces and the leg warmers that have been staples of Precure design up to this point. I think it would have felt lighter if those were gone. Generally, though, this season felt like it was something of a step down when it came to magical girl designs. I didn't end up really liking any of them, and given what I have seen for what is coming up, I'm fairly secure in the thought that this is the lowest the designs will ever go. If you've been following these videos that I'm making about Precure as a series, you'll know that I'm taking a moment near the end of each video to talk about how queer each season ends up feeling, and I have to say that this season felt straighter than the last two did. I could see some flickers if someone wanted to read into things, but it wasn't nearly as strong as the last two seasons. If you want to read into the subtext of holding hands, maybe, but I don't feel like there's much new here to mine, because the last seasons also had a lot of holding hands subtext. This season is safe, to say the least, and I think that's why it gets a little lost in the shuffle compared to other seasons. There are some aspects that are undoubtedly improvements over the last season, such as pacing, villains, sidecast, and more. But at the same time, the way that the main Precures feel so much like clones of the first season's girls with just a little adjusting means it can feel like it's lacking its own distinct voice at points. I feel like this was needed as a transitory period to get people used to the cast swapping out, but that did keep it from reaching to higher heights at the same time, which does suck. Add in the fact that this is sandwiched between the 2 seasons that kicked the series off and the 2 seasons that introduced the first group of 5, which I'm given to understand was a popular set of characters. Splash Star ends up getting a little forgotten in the shuffle or disregarded as being one of the lesser seasons, a knockoff of Futari Wa and Max Heart. And that's just not the case. I'd personally put this above those two. I had more fun here, even if the formula just isn't perfected yet. And with that, I think we're ready to move on to the next. And if you've stayed this long, you can stay a little longer for my spiel, please and thank you. You see, I am an itty bitty channel here, and as a result, subscriptions, likes, comments, any form of engagement help me more than you will ever know to get my content picked up by the almighty algorithm. If you've stayed this long, I'm guessing you saw something that you liked, so any help would be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much.